Thanks, Joe. Firstly, congratulations, guys. Susanna, as a ring-in, must be the best ring-in in the world to be brought in at late notice. Well done. And I think Pierce Lyons would have been very proud. My question actually is on the research that's been done. The use of the term 3-NOP, I would have thought would have been off-putting to any consumer as a chemical term. Would we have had a different result if we had used the term Bovaer or a marketing name rather than a chemical name?
100%, yes. Names matter. And we, at the time of the research, I think Bovaer wasn't approved in the United States yet. I'm trying to remember the timeline of all of this. Yeah, so thank you. So, so I think we opted for the 3-NOP, and we see that in the results, right? Like, it was the least preferred across the board. It barely moved market shares, even with information. There is definitely anti-chemical sentiment coming out, 100%. So yeah, marketing matters. Yeah.
I think it goes to me over here. I don't know. I'm going to speak. I had a text message for you, Kelly. I guess somebody's watching us online here about your seaweed, the survey there with the seaweed. Were the respondents aware of bromoform at all in that survey, and how do you think your responses would have changed?
Great question. No, we did not give any information about bromoform, and it wasn't in any of our questions. At the time, we weren't informed about it as well. I mean, I was introduced to it these last 3 days. So that's probably a misstep on our part to not have included that in our study. Yep, but future research.
Thank you all. There are many people who you think might be natural allies, the George Monbiot's, the Bruce Friedrichs, etc., passionate environmentalists, but also anti-meat. And there's that whole concept of, there's a lot of crossover in people's ambitions, but there's also the areas of differentiation, but you're always better off having allies than enemies. So how'd you go about building bridges with those potential allies where there's probably much more in common than difference to have a broader message and try and get more people on side?
I think a big part of this is finding those points of common ground. And I've had many such experiences, especially when I go around wearing World Without Cows merchandise. I'm wearing a small pin today. Sometimes it's a shirt, sometimes it's a hat. And sometimes in groups that would not be very friendly to a lot of what we've shared today. But oftentimes I find that there are points in which we can agree, where they would say, from a social justice perspective, getting enough nutrition to all is something we can all agree on. And we know that we cannot do that on plants alone. It is not possible. And whether you look at the protein upcycling, whether you look at marginal land discussions, they begin to come around to the fact that, yes, as long as you're not going to force me to eat beef, I will be okay, and support the fact that we do need livestock production. And so I think we need to work from that perspective of where we can find those points of common ground is critically important to the discussion. And I think some of that's also moving offline. We depend so much on social media discussions, and we tend to only think that that is the way to communicate. And it's a very different discussion when you can look eye to eye with someone. And so I do encourage us to get back to that and create open spaces for those types of dialogues.
I know, I'll add to that, as a practitioner in this space, it's not necessarily those people with those voices, right? They've built a brand on having discussions a certain way and talking about things a certain way, but their audiences are up for grabs as well. So if we can find ways to inform, to engage with those audiences that they're reaching, I think it's vitally important. And at the center, we start by building a foundation of knowledge, right? So many of our people that come to our website, almost 2/3 are from Google. People with just very benign questions. What do cows eat? How do cows produce methane? What's a digester? And if they're not landing on our pages, then what pages are they landing on, right? If they're not talking with people like this or people in this room, then who are they talking to? there, right? And as was mentioned earlier, people are further and further away from the farm, right? Less than 1% of the population works on a farm. It used to be our parents' farm, our grandparents' farm. Now it's your great-grandparents' farm, right? So that proximity to knowledge is gone as well, right? And so, and Ginger mentioned, maybe, I don't know if you mentioned it, this the spiral of silence, right? Where we think that everybody thinks one thing, right? But I think something different, but I'm not gonna say anything because I think everybody thinks, animals are bad for the planet, right? But we know that 98% of refrigerators in this country have animal source foods. So clearly not everybody's thinking that animals are bad, animal source foods are bad there. We had one more question. They have a mic in hand, so I don't wanna. 2 more questions, I'm sorry.
I think it's working now. Okay. So I originally had like a 3-part question, but some people have already asked some of them. But I did still want to ask in regards to the surveys using seaweed and looking at consumer acceptance and the term of bromoform versus seaweed for the whole panel. Do you think that there may be any negative consequences in the long run to our dairy farmers and beef producers if that type of transparency about what the active component of maybe a naturally occurring feed additive might be, starting now in the research and development phase?
Yeah, so I think that kind of what Kelly and I both found is if you give just kind of high levels of information, consumers have knee-jerk reactions, but if we were to get more granular into kind of what is behind some of these products, maybe that changes. And both Kelly and I's work is from a few years back, and it's crazy how quickly the science continues to evolve in this space. And so I think probably both of us would say that if we were to go again and do these sorts of surveys, we would probably have different information simply because you all are creating more information for us to work with, right? And so I think as we go forward as kind of scientists more on the consumer side of things, being really up on that information is going to be really helpful as we continue to develop surveys and figure out kind of the nudges that could potentially be occurring here in the next few years.
Yeah, I think last night in the van, I told my van members that I wish I had attended this summit 3 years ago, right, at the beginning, so that I would have had more information and more conversations with you all about the cutting edge science versus what you see in the literature, right? So I think this interdisciplinary dialogue is really, really valuable, and there are economists that are interested in this work as well.
Sure, I'll just quickly add that a lot of this is due to this lack of trust in science, and I'll just say that we have a lot of work to be done in science literacy, media literacy, portraying science, and yeah, the overall disposition of the scientific process. I wish I'd put up an Albert Einstein quote that I'll butcher, but try and rendition here, is that science is infantile, that it's adolescent, but it's still the best thing we have. And so that's the beast of burden for a science communicator, is to relay transparently, accurately, truthfully, like Jamie's saying, the work of scientists, and positing it just as that this is the best we have. Most of us in the room are probably data-driven decision makers. So both kind of, as I mentioned earlier, doing the data justice, but also using our social science techniques to motivate toward our desired outcomes.
Thank you all for your presentations. Do you think it would be more or less effective to communicate reductions based on carbon equivalents versus methane reduction? And of course, with methane reduction, there's perhaps more education of the consumer that we need. But with carbon reductions, it's a more complex calculation as well.
There have been a couple of studies on carbon reductions, particularly among US consumers, a carbon footprint label. European consumers are responding to the carbon footprint label on animal products particularly. US consumers, not so much. So statistically speaking, maybe not. But again, it depends on what information is out there and what level of information you're providing along with that label, as in any case.
All right, maybe the last question. I'm sure this room is just full of questions right now. So really excited and really happy this panel occurred, and I hope that we continue to see this. You know, Ginger, you in your slides earlier, you showed, you know, that distribution. You see this movable middle, and you know, and then you mentioned like that the Oatly commercial. We say no cows, and then we moved that polar opposite. We look at, okay, world without cows. I think, you know, obviously that effort is in the middle, and that's where we need to be. So how do we really bridge that communication gap of we know that there's going to be animals on the landscape, and we're going to be better off for it economically, socially, across, you know, nutritionally across the board. But how do we communicate that we still have room to do better and to continue to improve every day, and that's where our efforts should be.
I'll kick us off here with a hopefully brief comment. Something we haven't mentioned so far is the power of trusted opinion leaders in this space and harnessing the power of those early adopters, those innovators. The theory of planned behavior has a construct called subjective norms, which is how we perceive our influential peers feel about our behavior. And that has a major influence on how we enact either pre-consciously or subconsciously to please those around us and act in accordance to those people that we want to be like and admire and value. And so, yeah, tapping into those trusted opinion leaders. And sometimes for a half practitioner, half scientist like myself, to hand the mic off to someone else can be humbling and challenging. But it's really, when we think about impact, a great place to start is to empowering others who are already in these social circles to do the communicating in a truthful and accurate way.
Truth and accuracy. I mean, I think we live and die on that because everything else becomes a short-term gain otherwise, and we lose the long game. And I think being honest about the struggle and the challenges and maybe the unintended consequences of decisions is also a very important piece of this. Earlier this year, I was in the room at an IPPE discussion that had a number of major restaurant brands on the panel. And one of the things that they said was incredibly helpful to them was getting out, spending time with the producer, saying, here's the pressure we're facing from stakeholders on X issue, and then asking the producer, what would it mean if we took action on this to you? And they said, we learned so many insights from them that changed what we did and ultimately created a much better solution. And so, again, it gets back to the collaboration, but it also gets back to that transparency and honesty about the struggle, which I think also relates a certain humility that people find to be endearing and accepting, to be invited into that struggle with you.
Okay, they will be here. Do you have a question? Yeah. You traveled a long way, so.
I'll be quick. This is hypothetical. I'm asking for a friend. If you wanted to become a better science communicator, there's a lot of scientists in the room. How do you go about doing that?
That's a fantastic question. And as a matter of fact, the faculty position I just accepted was a novel development in the college to answer this exact call of working with extension agents and faculty on being science communicators. And I kind of passively mentioned that I hope this is an effort to make space for these conversations, is to make space for this in your scientific process. The comment Joe made earlier about it being too late, engage with your communication team, engage with the social scientists early on in the process, but also there are wonderful resources online that are easy to engage with. The American Association for the Advancement of Science is one. They have some great resources online. And then those key principles of thinking about your audience, thinking about the end user, your stakeholders, and I call them links of the chain in the scientific process, all the way from identifying your collaborators, those stakeholders who are going to have that input on the front end, all the way to dissemination of really being intentional and carefully outlining who should be in this conversation and integrating them early on in the process. And so encourage you to get to know the social scientists on your campus, as well as the communication practitioners to guide these efforts. And then hopefully this sparks some curiosity and we might make some more space for being intentional here. That's a great question. Thank you.
Well, they're of course going to be around. They are all very interested, our academics here, in more research. So if you have any ideas, please, and they have ideas too. So please connect with them. We're going to break for lunch till 2 p.m. So you have an hour and a half still for lunch, and then we'll get going then. Thank you so much to our panel.